The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Welcome to Getting to Know You. My name is Joe Nash, and today we have, for his third appearance here, third time here, the 18th President of the United States, General Ulysses S. Grant. So welcome back, General.
Thank you.
Mr. President, I should say. Today we're going to be talking about your relationship with President Abraham Lincoln and in the Civil War, basically. So why don't we start with your first meeting, the first time you met Lincoln. Is this true? The first time you met him is when you were appointed the head of the Union Army, and apparently your predecessors, Generals McLellan, Burnside, Hooker, and Mead, weren't as successful with Lincoln. So could you tell us how you got appointed and working with President Lincoln? It's a long...
Well, I'll tell you about our first meeting, and then I will answer the second question.
Okay.
I was called to Washington. I had been in the Western Theater for most of the war, but in March 1864, I was appointed to command all the Union armies, and there was a reception at the White House. Now, Abraham Lincoln is about 6'2", or he was, rather. Yeah. I'm barely 5'8". We were in a reception room, packed. No one could see me. So President Lincoln had me stand up on a couch in the White House so that everyone could get a look at me. And that's a silly little story, but I think it is indicative of our relationship, believe it or not. President Lincoln was not stymied by rank and what other people thought was appropriate, and neither was I. Yeah. He didn't think twice. The White House couch could have been up there since Jefferson, for all I know. And my boots were muddy, but no, up on the couch. And I was quite willing to do that. Okay. So.
Now, I understand that during the war, you were appointed in March of 1864. I understand during the war, Lincoln sort of had his eye on you during the war?
And I had my eye on him.
Oh, okay.
I'd first become aware of him during the Mexican War. I was fighting in Mexico. He was a congressman who opposed the war. And anytime we got newspapers from the States, I would read his speeches in Congress damning the Mexican War. And I supported that wholeheartedly. I thought it was a terrible mistake, but I'm a soldier. I can't say that. I must follow orders. So early on, I was aware of Mr. Lincoln. As the election of 1860 approached, I was not in his camp. I was a Douglas Democrat. I knew that Lincoln was not a radical abolitionist as the South was portraying him, but I did know that if he was elected, the South would secede. And I wanted my country to buy time. So in the end, I did not vote for Mr. Lincoln in 1860. Oh, okay. As the war went on, and I began to win a few victories in the West, I would receive congratulatory telegrams, and that was fine, but a little embarrassing. I didn't have a sense of the man initially. But as time went on, I realized that we were kindred spirits in many ways. I think one of the reasons for that was we grew up in the same region of the country. He in southernmost Illinois, I in southernmost Ohio, right on the border with Kentucky, a slave state. So we had much exposure to Southerners and their way of thinking. And so when the war began, freeing the slaves was not an objective. And Mr. Lincoln didn't say it was, and I did not enlist to free slaves. I enlisted to save the Union. Step by step, we both began to awaken when it came to the question of abolition and finally freeing the slaves. Mr. Lincoln issued the preliminary the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862. When it became law on January 1st, 1863, there was a new sentence added, which said black men could now enlist in the Union armies.
That wasn't in the original proclamation.
It was not.
Okay.
Now, here's how much I had changed over time. I thought the war would be over quickly, and I wanted to show the Southerners that I was reasonable. And so early in the war, when escaped slaves would reach my lines, and the slave catchers would be right after them, I would expel the slave catchers from my camp. But I would also expel the freed slave to show that I was even-handed. Finally, January of 1863, it is obvious that the North needs more manpower. And the freed slaves and the free men of color in the North want to enlist. And I have come around to believing that this is a good idea. After the Battle of Shiloh, I realized the war was not going to be over quickly. At Shiloh, in 2 days, more Americans were lost than in all of America's wars combined up to that point. More Americans were lost at Shiloh in 2 days than we lost in the Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican War. And when that happened, I realized we're going to need every man who can carry a weapon. And the slaves say, let us fight for our freedom.
How many ultimately freed slaves or free blacks in the North, how many ultimately enlisted?
180,000.
180,000.
And 40,000 never lived to see the end of the war. It's not fashionable to say it now, but the truth is we could not have won the war without them.
Okay. Now, one thing when I was mentioning President Lincoln had sort of his eye on you until you were appointed in 1864, you were sort of known as a fighter. Could you, I would think all generals would have been, but why were you particularly known as a, what did Lincoln like about you?
Well, I have to say, he slowly came around to thinking I was an asset. After Shiloh, I can't tell you how many people whispered in his ear that although it was a Union victory, it had cost so many lives. I clearly was a butcher who had no respect for human life, and I should be cashiered from the Army. And the president had to weigh that. And in the end, he said, I can't spare Grant. This man fights. And yet, in the next year, we were both wary of each other. He kept hearing that I was a drinker. And as he was thinking perhaps I should be promoted, he had to know if those rumors were true. So he had a man from the War Department come out west and shadow me for months. And Mr. Dana eventually...
Did you know that you were being shadowed?
Oh, of course I did. Of course I did. But Mr. Dana eventually let the president know that I did drink. In fact, virtually every officer he met did drink. But I was never incapacitated. Alcohol did not bring me to my knees, as my critics were implying, that this was exaggerated. And the president heard all this, and finally he said in one of his cabinet meetings, find out what Grant drinks and send some to my other generals. And that was because, to answer your question, I was a bulldog. I would not let go. On any given day, my troops might be defeated, but I would not retreat. I understood very early on that the only way to defeat the South was to give them no rest anywhere. By contrast, the other generals you mentioned, they, on any given day, might win a battle, but the day they lost, they would pull their troops away, they would disengage, they would send the Union troops into camps to rest and resupply, and in doing so, they were giving the rebels time to do just the same. Whereas, as I say, once I sunk my teeth in, I was not going to let go.
And then Lincoln, this aspect of your generalship, Lincoln liked this, admired this, I guess you could say.
He might have what?
He admired this about you.
He realized that this was what was needed. Lincoln was a very unique individual, utterly determined to save the country, but compassionate, the most compassionate man I ever met. So when he realized that this degree of bloodshed was necessary, it broke his heart.
So it was a combination, once you won the Battle of Vicksburg, could you say it was a combination of you winning Vicksburg, and was it General Meade at the time wasn't doing as well? How did you finally, ultimately, get appointed? And
well, Vicksburg fell on the same day that Gettysburg was won,
okay.
And that was Meade in the East. I think what really made the difference was two things in relation to those two battles. My approach to Vicksburg was, and I will admit it, very intricate and complicated. And the president and many of the cabinet were doubtful that I knew what I was doing. In the end, the president did not interfere. He gave me as much leeway as I requested. And when the city fell, I received a telegram from him saying, I was wrong, and you were right. Mm-hmm. What president ever admits to anybody that he was wrong? But he saw that in my complicated tactics and strategy, I really did know what I was doing. Whereas, back east at Gettysburg, General Meade did defeat Lee, but he didn't follow up the victory. He allowed the Army of Northern Virginia to get back to Virginia intact. And the president was enraged by that.
It sounds like President Lincoln knew what was going on in all these different battles.
He did.
How did that work? Did he have intelligence, or did he?
My understanding is he practically lived at the telegraph office in the War Department.
Okay.
We forget that the nation was crisscrossed with telegraph lines.
Okay.
And within a day, he could have very thorough information about what was happening. Okay.
So you were appointed in March of 1864, and of course the war was concluded a year later. How was it that last year? Why do you think you guys worked so well together, you and President Lincoln?
Well, we both had finally admitted that it was going to be a war of attrition, that at the very start of the war, General Winfield Scott, who had fought in the War of 1812, was in command of the armies. Everyone thought he was senile, but he wasn't.
Oh, yeah.
My point is that he came up with a plan right at the start of the war, which he called the Anaconda Plan. The idea being that you don't just attack Richmond. You bring pressure to bear on all corners of the Confederacy at the same time so that rebel troops in Georgia can't be spared to go to Virginia to back up Lee. The Anaconda Plan was essentially what I followed. I modified it, but it was the right approach. And President Lincoln had come around to believing that was true.
Okay. Now, I know you might not want to speak ill of your predecessors. Why do you think Generals McLellan, Burnside, Hooker, and Meade, I don't want to know, is it true enough to say they failed, or why was it that they didn't last too long as commanders?
Some truthfully were incompetent. McLellan absolutely loved his troops sincerely, and they loved him. But he had wider plans. He ran against Lincoln for the presidency in 1864. And my belief is that any officer who had a political agenda always erred on the side of caution. If a battle went poorly, he would pull his men out because he knew back home the voters would never support him in the future on account of high casualties, which I understand the mathematics, but that is no way to win a war.
Okay. Now, I understand also during that last year, President Lincoln, he actually visited your headquarters. What was that?
Many times.
What was that like in Virginia?
Well, we had bogged down into the war of attrition that I feared but knew was necessary. We were besieging Petersburg in Virginia. The siege went on for 9 months. You'd have to see a map to understand that if Petersburg fell, Richmond would fall, the Confederate government would fail. There was a series of dominoes that would ensue. So we had to lay siege to Petersburg, which meant my headquarters at City Point stayed in one spot for months, which was very unusual. And the president came down late in 1864 for a council of war with myself and General Sherman and others. That was the first time he had come to City Point. It was all business. And then he went back to Washington. I can't remember who it was, but someone on my staff some weeks later said, I think the president is being destroyed by the burden of the war. He needs a place to go where the burden will be lifted. Why don't you invite him back, more or less socially? Okay. And I did. And it turned out that we were both horse lovers. We would often go riding together.
Just the two of you?
Just the two of it. Well, yeah. There was an entourage, okay. I suppose. But one of the things that amused the president, my favorite war horse was Cincinnati. He was 17 hands high. He was enormous. And I would let almost no one ride him except the president. And when President Lincoln was on Cincinnati, okay. He was regal. This tall man on this great horse. He looked regal. But what really amused the president, I had another horse, shorter, scruffier, not nearly a war horse, that I had named Jefferson Davis. And it just amused President Lincoln no end to ride Jefferson Davis. Right. The long legs almost dragging the ground, but he could legitimately say, I have put Jefferson Davis through his paces. And, well, yeah, what I'm saying is...
How many times did he come?
Oh, 3, 4, 5.
Oh, okay.
And for the most part, it was very relaxed. There were occasions when that wasn't true. He sometimes brought Mrs. Lincoln with him, and my wife, Julia, was with me. The social occasions usually worked out, but there was one instance when they didn't, and actually this has a profound effect on the Ford's Theater chapter of this story. Okay. We had gone riding. Well, the president and I were inspecting the troops. They were about to take the offensive against the rebels. And in that circumstance, women are not allowed in the military camps.
Right before a battle. Right
before a battle. However, the wife of the president, my wife, were exceptions. So they were brought out to where we were inspecting the troops in an ambulance. And as they looked out, they saw that riding next to the president was another woman. And Mrs. Lincoln created a scene that embarrassed the president, mortified him. She was extremely jealous, had no idea why a woman would be riding with her husband. It turned out, we found out later, that Secretary of War Stanton had given her permission to be there. Yeah. And Mrs. Lincoln screamed and carried on, not quite like a mad woman, but it was embarrassing, and the troops heard it, and my wife, Julia, attempted to calm her. Succeeded to a degree, but later Mrs. Lincoln was cold towards Julia, obviously embarrassed that she had seen that moment, and Julia became awkward in Mrs. Lincoln's company. Therefore, when the president invited us to go to Ford's Theater on that fateful night, Julia said, I really don't want to go. I'm very uncomfortable around Mrs. Lincoln. We haven't seen our children all together in one place for years, it seems. Beg off, please. Let's just go home to New Jersey and see the children. And so I begged off. And we were not at Ford's Theater that evening, primarily because my wife was very uncomfortable around Mrs. Lincoln.
Okay. Now I understand the president's son? He was on your staff? What?
At the end of the war, Robert Lincoln was a captain on my staff, and this brings us back to Mary Lincoln. I know now that she is in the history book, so to speak. What has been attached to her name is that she really was emotionally fragile all the time, on the brink of insanity, and so on. What I saw in her was a woman who was terrified of losing her children. She and the president had lost one of their sons when they were living in Illinois. And they lost another of their children when they were in the White House. And so when Robert, the eldest, said, "I want to go to the war," Mary Lincoln was terrified. The president could not let his son go. That would just have been wrong. But he sent a letter to me that was remarkable. He did not order me to take Robert on my staff. He asked if that would be all right. He said, "If you feel he would interfere in any way, please be honest and tell me. I won't hold it against you." What I saw was Abraham Lincoln trying to protect his wife from the anguish and agony of having a son in battle. The president was a kind and compassionate man, and that letter to me, which was not an order but a request, reflected that.
And what was he on your staff? Just one of your?
He was just one of my many aides.
Many, okay. So you mentioned that you did not take the trip on that fateful night to Ford's Theater. So when was the last time you actually saw President Lincoln?
I saw the president the day of the assassination.
Oh, that same day? Oh, okay.
The very day. Lee had surrendered to me a week before. I had come to Washington to the War Department to meet with Secretary of War Stanton. We knew the war was ending, and I was there to cancel contracts that we had and so forth for supplying the Army. Stanton and I agreed to end the military draft immediately. We had work to do. But while I was in Washington, the president invited me to a cabinet meeting. And
Was that a common thing for a general to?
I don't think so. I don't think so at all. And I saw aspects of Mr. Lincoln I couldn't have seen anywhere else. Much had to be discussed at that cabinet meeting, how to begin to think about reconstructing the South.
Well, the war had only ended, 4 days before?
It wasn't even over yet. Another army, Confederate army, was still in the field, and Sherman was facing him in North Carolina. But what I saw in that meeting, many in the cabinet, the Confederate government was fleeing, leaders of the rebellion were running for foreign countries. Many in the cabinet wanted to track these men down, grab them, and hang them. They were traitors. And President Lincoln said, "No, I will not hang even the worst of them. Enough blood has been shed. However, if they're running for the borders, we should give the appearance of giving chase, but we should just let them get away."
Okay.
The man had had enough of bloodshed.
And so you were saying many in the cabinet were seeking vengeance, would you say? Was that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So what do you think would have happened? I mean, maybe, I'm sure you speculated on this. What do you think would have happened, or if you had went to the play that night with the president and his wife?
Well, what I truly think would have happened was the president would have died anyway. I went to Ford's Theater in the days after the assassination, and I saw how the chairs had been arranged in the presidential box. I knew where I would have been seated. The door to the presidential box opened directly behind the president's chair. I would not have been able to see Booth coming in. I believe Booth would have been able to shoot the president. The difference is, although he was armed with a knife, he had a single-shot Derringer, killed the president, he had the knife, I think I could have stopped him from escaping.
He ended up jumping over the...
Yes, I think I could have stopped him. The officer that was there, Major Rathbone, attempted that and was sliced almost to the bone by the knife. But frankly, I was a lot stronger than Rathbone. I mean, I don't pride myself on much, but I pride myself on my strength. I believe I could have taken Booth alive, and that would have been significant.
Well, what would you say, what's your final assessment of President Lincoln, both as a president and as a man? You know, he's so revered, you know, all through history now. How would you sum it up after working with him and winning the Civil War and all that?
I think he was an absolutely unique blend of what is best in Americans. On the one hand, when there was a cause or principle to fight for, to never give up. But on the other hand, to be as compassionate to your foe as circumstances allow. The president would not hang the worst of the traitors, and said so. And when I offered the terms that I did to Robert E. Lee, take an oath of allegiance, and you can go home, keep the peace, no one will bother you, Abraham Lincoln endorsed that 100%. He was the right man in the right place at the right time. I think we owe much to him.
And finally, I guess a question I'm sure you've speculated on. What do you think if the president hadn't been assassinated? Do you think Reconstruction
would have been much different? Reconstruction could have been the time when the freed slaves, the black people of the South and the white people of the South turned over a new leaf and a new chapter really began. I toured the South just months after the defeat. The Southern whites were ready to do anything to restore a decent life. They were open to the idea of accepting blacks on equal terms. But then Andrew Johnson became president. Andrew Johnson hated traitors, but he hated black people worse. So when the Southerners began instituting the black codes and essentially returning the slaves to slavery,
he went along.
He endorsed it, and we haven't recovered from that since.
Okay. Well, General Grant, it's been nice having you here again, and we're filming this in February. This is the month of President Lincoln's birthday. Thanks for coming back, and I'm sure we'll see you again in the future.
Well, I look forward to it.
Okay, and we'll see you next time on Getting to Know You.